The carriage wheels stuttered over frozen ruts as Arabella Dashwood pressed her gloved fingers against the window glass and watched the fog devour the last remnants of moonlight somewhere beyond Windsor Forest's ancient oaks. October had arrived with unseasonable cold, and she could see her breath clouding the interior, despite the foot-warmer that had gone tepid an hour past, much like her prospects after another spectacularly unsuccessful London season, where she had achieved the dubious distinction of being entirely overlooked by even the most desperate fortune hunters once they learned the Dashwood name carried more debt than dowry. 28 years old, too tall by half, too bookish by reputation, and possessed of a tongue that refused to simper even when strategy demanded it, Arabella had endured 3 months of pitying glances from debutantes young enough to be her daughters and knowing smiles from matrons who remembered when she had been the one in white muslin with foolish hopes intact. Her travelling dress was well made, but the fabric had seen 3 seasons, and the lace at her cuffs had been turned twice by her own hand, small economies that screamed genteel poverty to anyone with eyes sharp enough to notice, which in London society meant everyone. Her maid Lydia dozed fitfully in the opposite seat, head lolling with each rut, and Arabella envied the girls' ability to sleep despite their circumstances, despite the fact they were travelling hours past any reasonable time, because Edmund's letter had been characteristically specific about arriving before his house party began, and characteristically vague about why her presence mattered when he typically preferred to forget he had an unmarried sister, consuming resources better spent on his own consequence. The forest pressed close on either side now, bare branches creating skeletal archways over the narrow road, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called with a sound like mourning. Arabella was contemplating whether it was possible to feel nostalgic for humiliation, for at least in London she had been visible in her invisibility, noticed in being overlooked, whereas at Edmund's estate she would simply cease to exist except as an object of charity, and pointed suggestions about governess positions, when the carriage lurched to a violent stop that sent Lydia tumbling to the floor with a shriek. The coachman's voice rose in protest, immediately silenced, and then came the sound Arabella had only read about in lurid novels she borrowed from circulating libraries and hid from Edmund's wife, the unmistakable heavy cadence of hoofbeats on packed earth as a rider approached through fog so thick it seemed to have substance. The carriage door wrenched open, and a man appeared framed in the opening, mounted on a black stallion that blew steam into the frozen air like some creature from mythology. And even in the dim light of the carriage lamps, Arabella could see the pistol in his hand held with the casual competence of someone intimately familiar with its use. He wore rough clothing, a greatcoat that had seen better decades, and a cloth tied across the lower half of his face. But something in the way he sat. His horse spoke of riding masters and generations of breeding, and when he spoke his voice carried the unmistakable accents of education layered over something raw and desperate. "Your jewels, madam," he said, "and before you protest their sentimental value, know that sentiment is a luxury I can no longer afford." Lydia had already fainted, sliding bonelessly back onto the seat with her mouth open in a manner that would have been comedic in any other circumstance. And Arabella found herself suddenly, inexplicably angry rather than afraid, furious at this final indignity in a season of indignities, at the presumption that she possessed anything worth stealing. "Then you'll be sorely disappointed, sir," she heard herself say with a tartness that emerged only when fear and fury collided. "I possess nothing of value. Even my family has made that abundantly clear." She saw his eyes through the mask, visible in the lamplight, and they were extraordinary, pale and intelligent, and haunted by something that made her breath catch for reasons entirely unrelated to the pistol. Those eyes studied her face with an intensity that felt almost physical, lingering on her features as though memorizing them or perhaps recognizing them. And she found she could not look away even as her heart hammered against her ribs. He was silent for a long moment, horse shifting beneath him, and then he said softly, "I doubt that very much. and the words carried a weight of meaning she could not begin to pass. He reached into the carriage then, long fingers catching her wrist with surprising gentleness, and pressed something into her palm, his hand closing her fingers around cold metal. His touch sent heat racing up her arm despite the temperature, and despite every rational thought, screaming that she should recoil, and she realized with distant shock that his hands were gentlemen's hands, no calluses, nails clean and well kept, hands that had never done manual labor despite the rough costume. "Keep this safe," he said, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Should you find yourself in danger, present it to any magistrate. They'll know what it means." "What does it mean?" Arabella demanded, finding her voice, though it emerged shakier than she wished. "Who are you?" But he was already withdrawing, the stallion dancing backward, and through the swirling fog, his eyes held hers for one more suspended moment. "Someone who once had everything and lost it," he said. "Much like yourself, I suspect." Then he was gone, hoofbeats swallowed by the mist, and she was left clutching whatever he had given her, while Lydia moaned herself back to consciousness, and the coachman called down to ask if they were unharmed. Arabella did not answer immediately, instead uncurling her fingers to stare at what lay in her palm, and her heart seemed to stop entirely. The ring was heavy gold, unmistakably expensive, set with a deep blue stone she thought might be sapphire, and engraved with a crest she recognized despite having never moved in circles, elevated enough to see it up close. The Wentworth crest, the ducal crest of a family so far above her own that they might as well inhabit different planets, belonging to a duke who had vanished from society 3 years past, under circumstances whispered about in scandalized tones at every gathering. Frederick Wentworth, once the most eligible man in England, now disappeared and rumored dead or fled to the continent or living in disgrace, depending on which gossip one believed. And here was his signet ring pressed into her hand by a highwayman with educated speech and aristocratic bearing, and eyes that suggested he knew precisely what it meant to lose everything. Arabella closed her fingers around the ring again as Lydia sat up sputtering about murderers and ravishment, and felt something shift inside her chest, some quality of resignation cracking like ice over a frozen pond. The robbery had taken her reticule with its handful of coins and the cameo brooch that had been her mother's, items whose loss she would feel keenly given her circumstances, but the highwayman had left her something infinitely more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. A mystery, a connection to scandal, and the strange, heated memory of those haunted eyes studying her face as though she mattered, as though she possessed value beyond dowries and marriage prospects and all the metrics by which women like her were measured and found wanting. The coachman was calling down again, and Lydia was demanding they turn back immediately, and Arabella tucked the ring into the pocket of her traveling dress, where it rested heavy and warm against her hip. And for the first time in months, she felt something other than weary resignation. She felt curious, alive, aware that the fog-shrouded forest and the mysterious highwayman and the impossible ring had somehow lifted her out of the narrow groove her life had carved and set her down in territory entirely unmapped. And though she knew she should be terrified, though every rule of propriety demanded she report the incident and surrender the ring to authorities, she found herself hoping with sudden fierce intensity that this strange midnight encounter was a beginning rather than an ending, a door opening rather than closing, an invitation into a story that might finally be her own. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Dashwood Manor rose from the Somerset countryside with the determined elegance of a family clinging to respectability by their fingernails, smaller than the great estates but tastefully appointed in a manner that suggested Edmund's wealthy wife had insisted on certain standards, and Arabella arrived just as October afternoon faded into the early darkness that characterized autumn in the countryside, leaves falling in drifts of gold and russet across the gravel drive, while servants scurried to prepare for the house party that would evidently showcase Edmund's ascent into circles he had spent his entire life desperately courting. Her brother met her in the entrance hall with the distracted air of a man whose hospitality was being tested beyond its limits, kissing her cheek perfunctorily, while his eyes tracked a footman carrying what appeared to be hothouse flowers toward the drawing-room, and his first words were not greeting, but instruction that she was to keep to her room during the initial arrivals, as he could not have her travel-worn appearance creating the wrong impression for guests of such elevated status. The new Duke of Wentworth was arriving within the hour, Edmund explained, with the reverent tone he reserved for discussing titles and income, along with his fiancée Miss Beatrice Tilney and a carefully curated selection of society's finest, and Arabella was to make herself presentable for dinner, where she would be seated far enough from the Duke to avoid any possibility of embarrassing conversation, but close enough that Edmund could claim family connection to aristocracy, however distant. Arabella murmured something appropriately meek, while her fingers found the ring in her pocket, now transferred to her day dress, and she wondered what Edmund would say if he knew she carried the signet of the previous Duke, the disgraced Frederick Wentworth, whose name could apparently not be spoken in polite company without someone crossing themselves as though warding off contagion. Her room was in the older wing as expected, cold despite a fire struggling in the grate, and the view looked onto the kitchen gardens rather than the ornamental grounds, a clear message about her status in this household, but Arabella barely noticed as she moved to the window and watched carriages begin arriving in the fading light, each one depositing guests in silk and superfine, while servants rushed to handle luggage and precedence. She saw him then, the new Duke, stepping down from a crested carriage with the uncertain movements of a man unused to such grandeur, and even from a distance she could see he lacked the natural authority that title required, his gestures too broad and his attention too obviously seeking approval from the woman who descended after him. Beatrice Tilney was beautiful in the cold, perfect way of porcelain, her mourning clothes expertly cut to emphasize her figure, while still suggesting appropriate grief. And as she took the Duke's arm, Arabella saw her eyes sweep the house and grounds with the calculating assessment of someone inventorying their future property. That evening's dinner was an exercise in social torture that Arabella had perfected the art of enduring, seated between a deaf elderly baron and a younger son too focused on the heiress across the table to notice her existence, while candlelight glittered off crystal and silver and the conversation flowed around her like water around a stone. She observed everything from her position of invisibility, noting how Alistair Wentworth drank too much claret and laughed too loudly at jokes that were barely amusing, how his hands trembled slightly when he reached for his glass, how he watched Beatrice with the obsessive attention of a man either desperately in love or desperately afraid. Beatrice herself presided over her end of the table with the confidence of someone already imagining herself as Duchess, her grief for her murdered sister apparently not severe enough to dampen her enjoyment of attention, and when her gaze landed on Arabella, it was with the focused malice of a cat spotting a mouse. "Miss Dashwood," Beatrice called out during a lull in conversation, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet, "you must share your wisdom with us younger ladies. After so many seasons, what advice would you give those of us still seeking advantageous matches?" The pause before she continued was perfectly timed. "Oh, forgive me. I forgot you haven't achieved one." The table fell silent except for the clink of silver on china, and Arabella felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from rage she had to swallow like bitter medicine, and she was aware of Edmund's warning glare from the head of the table, his expression promising recrimination later. "I would advise discernment, Miss Tilney," Arabella said calmly, meeting those calculating eyes directly. Some fates are worse than spinsterhood. She saw Beatrice's smile sharpen and knew she had made an enemy. But the ring in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, and she found she did not care as much as she should have, found that Beatrice's cruelty had somehow freed her from the obligation to care about opinions from someone who performed grief while planning weddings. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation and Edmund's pointed ignoring of her existence. And when the ladies withdrew, Arabella excused herself with a headache that was not entirely feigned, escaping to the library rather than her cold room because she needed books the way other people needed air. The library at Dashwood Manor had been her refuge during childhood visits, a long room lined with oak shelving and furnished with chairs that had molded themselves to generations of readers. But tonight it felt different, dusty and neglected, as though Edmund's new status had no room for such old-fashioned pursuits. Most of the books were covered with Holland sheets like shrouded corpses, and the fire was unlit. But Arabella found candles and settled into a corner chair, pulling a volume at random, only to discover it was a collection of philosophical essays that had clearly been read extensively, the margins filled with annotations in a bold, slanting hand. She was puzzling over a particularly insightful notation about Locke when she noticed the name inscribed on the flyleaf: Frederick Wentworth, and the date suggested he had owned these books before his disgrace, before Edmund had somehow acquired them in whatever dispersal of property had followed the scandal. Her heart began to race as she moved through the shelves, finding more volumes with the same name, and then she discovered them at the back of a lower shelf, hidden behind a stack of agricultural journals, 3 leather-bound books that had clearly been damaged by fire, their edges charred and covers warped, but contents largely intact. Private journals, the kind gentlemen kept to record thoughts they could not speak aloud, and Arabella knew she should not read them. Knew that whatever privacy Frederick Wentworth had lost he deserved to keep in these pages, but her fingers were already opening the first volume, and her eyes were already consuming the words written in that same bold hand. The entries began 5 years prior, and detailed the mundane concerns of a young duke, estate management and parliamentary obligations, and the endless social requirements of his position, but gradually the tone shifted into something more revealing, more raw. He wrote about the weight of expectation, the loneliness of being valued only for title and fortune, the growing realization that everyone around him wanted something and no one simply wanted him. And Arabella felt tears prick her eyes because she understood that isolation in her bones, understood what it meant to be reduced to a single quality, and found wanting. Then came entries about Henrietta Tilney, the courtship that was more negotiation than romance, the engagement that satisfied everyone except the parties involved, and the words were devastating in their honesty. "I am to marry Henrietta in a fortnight," he had written in an entry dated 3 weeks before the scandal. "She is beautiful, well-bred, and utterly miserable. As am I. We are both prisoners of expectation, and I fear what we may become to each other, jailer and captive, by turns." There were more entries, increasingly desperate. And then the journal ended abruptly with no explanation, no final entry to explain what had happened or why, and Arabella sat in the dark library with tears on her cheeks for a man she had met only as a highwayman, but who she was coming to know through his words, this brilliant, sensitive, trapped soul who had somehow ended up accused of murder and living in the margins of society. A sound in the doorway made her look up sharply, and she saw Edmund silhouetted against the hall light, his expression caught between concern and irritation. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said without preamble, closing the door behind him. "Beatrice Tilney will be a duchess. You'd do well to cultivate her favor rather than trading barbs. The current duke is her second attempt at the title, isn't he?" Arabella heard herself say, the journal still open in her lap. One wonders what happened to her first opportunity. Edmund's face darkened, and he crossed to her quickly, snatching the journal from her hands. "Where did you find these? They should have been destroyed." "Henrietta's death was thoroughly investigated," he said, and his voice carried a warning she had never heard before. "Frederick Wentworth was a murderer. Such talk is dangerous, particularly for an unmarried woman with no prospects and no protection. He will ruin you even from beyond the grave if you're not careful." But Arabella was not listening, was instead remembering the highwayman's eyes and the gentleness of his touch and the desperate intelligence in these pages, and she knew with sudden certainty that whatever had happened 3 years ago, whatever blood had been found, and whatever evidence had condemned him, Frederick Wentworth was not a murderer any more than she was the pathetic spinster Beatrice had painted her. Edmund was still speaking, something about a governess position with a family in Yorkshire and how she needed to be practical about her future, but Arabella stood and took the journals back from his hands with a firmness that surprised them both. "These belong to someone," she said quietly, "and I intend to return them." Then she walked past him toward her cold room in the old wing, the journals clutched against her chest and the ring burning in her pocket, and she knew that she had crossed some invisible line tonight, had stopped being the invisible, overlooked creature who accepted humiliation as her due and become instead someone who asked questions and demanded answers and refused to believe that the official story was the true one, and though she knew this transformation would bring consequences she could not yet imagine, she also knew there was no going back to the safety of resignation, not now that she had felt the alternative stirring in her blood like springtime after an endless winter. Sleep proved impossible after Beatrice Tilney announced over dessert that Arabella would make an excellent companion for elderly Lady Morland, who required someone educated enough to read aloud, but not so attractive as to draw attention from her ladyship's consequence, and the assembled guests had laughed behind their fans, while Edmund nodded as though this were a compliment rather than another calculated humiliation designed to remind Arabella of her place in the social order. She had excused herself early again, claiming the headache that was becoming her constant companion, but instead of retreating to her cold room, she found herself pulling on her heaviest cloak over her nightgown and slipping down the servants' stairs into the October night, drawn by restlessness that felt like madness, by the need to breathe air that had not been, poisoned by false laughter and calculating cruelty. The gardens at Dashwood Manor were not extensive, but they had been designed with romance in mind, all winding paths and hidden grottos and a central fountain whose marble nymphs poured water in an endless cascade that masked sound and created privacy. And Arabella walked without destination through beds of roses dying their annual death, petals scattering across frost that glittered like diamond dust in the moonlight. Her hair hung loose down her back, unchaperoned and indecent, and she knew she should care about propriety, but found she had exhausted her capacity for caring somewhere between Beatrice's announcement and Edmund's approving nod, found that the ring in her pocket had become a talisman against the kind of resignation that led to companion positions and slow suffocation in someone else's household. She was standing beside the fountain, one hand trailing in water cold enough to sting, when she heard the footsteps behind her and turned to find the highwayman emerging from the shadows of a marble Apollo, and this time she was not afraid, but rather filled with a fierce gladness that shocked her with its intensity. "You came back," she said simply, and watched him move into the moonlight with that same aristocratic grace that had marked him during the robbery. Tall and broad-shouldered beneath the rough clothing, his face still masked, but his eyes visible and fixed on her with an expression she could not name. "I should not have," he replied, voice rough as though the words cost him something. "You should be inside, safe and warm and as far from me as possible. But here we are." Arabella reached into her cloak pocket and withdrew the ring, holding it up so gold and sapphire caught the moonlight. "Here we are indeed," she said, "and I think it's time you told me the truth, Your Grace, She saw him go very still, saw something like pain flash across the visible portion of his face, and then, slowly, deliberately, he reached up and pulled the mask away, revealing features she recognized from portraits she had seen in her research, from the miniature that had been reproduced in scandal sheets 3 years prior. Frederick Wentworth was handsome in an austere way, all sharp angles and intelligent eyes, but what struck her was not his appearance, but rather the vulnerability in his expression, the way he looked at her as though she held his entire future in her hands, and he was bracing for her to crush it. "You're either the Duke of Wentworth or a madman," Arabella said, keeping her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "Possibly both. On most days, I confess I don't know which," Frederick replied, and something like humor flickered in his eyes before fading. "Do you believe me? That I'm who I claim to be, or that I'm not a murderer?" "Both," Arabella said, and she moved closer, studying his face in the moonlight, seeing exhaustion and desperation and a kind of loneliness that mirrored her own. "I've read your journals. The man who wrote those words couldn't murder anyone, but I've also learned that desperation changes people." "I am desperate, Miss Dashwood," Frederick said quietly, and she saw his hands clench at his sides as though he were restraining himself from reaching for her. "Desperate enough to involve you in something that could destroy what remains of your reputation. I shouldn't have come tonight. I should leave you to your safe, predictable life and stop dragging you into my nightmare." "And yet you did come," Arabella pressed. "Why? Why give me the ring? Why appear now, in my brother's garden, when you could have simply disappeared?" Frederick was silent for a long moment, water from the fountain the only sound between them, and when he spoke his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because in all of England, you're the only person who looked at that ring and didn't immediately turn it over to authorities. You hesitated. That hesitation has haunted me for 3 weeks. I've watched you, these past days, seen how they treat you, how they dismiss you and mock you and act as though you're invisible, and I recognized something of myself in you. I hesitated because I know what it means to be judged unfairly," Arabella said, and found herself moving closer still, close enough to see the grey threading through his dark hair, close enough to smell horse and night air, and something indefinably masculine. "Society has convicted us both. You of murder, me of the crime of being inconvenient. You are not inconvenient," Frederick said with sudden fierce intensity, and this time he did reach for her, his hands catching her shoulders with a gentleness that belied his desperation. "You are extraordinary. You're intelligent and brave, and you see things others miss, and I should not be saying any of this, should not be touching you, but I cannot seem to help myself." He released her abruptly, stepping back, and Arabella felt the loss of his touch like cold water. "Will you help me?" he asked. "I need someone inside the house party, someone who can search for evidence while I watch from outside. I believe Beatrice Tilney orchestrated everything. Henrietta is her sister. She was always jealous that Henrietta was chosen to marry a duke while Beatrice was overlooked, and when Henrietta came to me desperate to escape the engagement, begging me to help her run away with the naval officer she truly loved, I agreed. I staged her disappearance, gave her money and time to flee, but someone planted that bloody dress in my study, someone who knew exactly what would happen when it was found. Beatrice inherited Henrietta's position, her engagement to ducal status, and now she's about to marry my cousin and secure the Wentworth fortune." Arabella's mind raced through implications, through the conspiracy suggested by his words. "Where is Henrietta now?" she asked. "Safe," Frederick said. "In Italy with her husband, living under an assumed name. I have letters from her, proof she's alive, but that only proves I helped her disappear. It doesn't prove I didn't murder her, doesn't clear my name or restore my title. I need evidence of who framed me and why. I need to prove Beatrice's involvement." "And you think I can find this evidence?" Arabella said slowly. "Yes," Frederick replied, You're invisible to them, just as you said. They don't notice you, don't guard their words around you. You can search rooms, overhear conversations, piece together what happened. But I'm asking you to risk everything. If you're caught, if your involvement with me is discovered, you'll be ruined beyond redemption. Arabella thought of Beatrice's cruel smile, of Edmund's casual dismissal, of the companion position that awaited her like a slow death. Yes, she said simply. I'll help you. But not because you flatter me. Because Beatrice Tilney enjoys cruelty, and I'd very much like to see her unmasked. Frederick stared at her for a long moment, and then laughed, the sound startled and genuine. You are remarkable, he said. I remembered you, you know, from years ago. You were 17, attending your first major ball, and I was 22 and new to the title and desperately awkward despite the best efforts of dancing masters and etiquette instructors. Everyone was watching me, judging me, laughing behind their fans at the country duke who didn't know how to navigate London society. You asked me to dance. You don't remember, do you? Arabella searched her memory and found a vague impression of a ball, of feeling sorry for a tall young man who stood alone looking miserable, but the details had been lost to time and the accumulation of subsequent humiliations. I was kind to you, she said slowly. Out of genuine kindness, Frederick corrected. Not because I was a duke or because you wanted something, but because you saw someone uncomfortable and chose compassion. You danced with me and made conversation about books, and for those few minutes I forgot to be terrified. I've never forgotten that. Never forgotten you. Even when I saw you 3 weeks ago on that forest road, I recognized you despite the years, despite everything. That's why I gave you the ring. That's why I trusted you with this. Arabella felt something shift in her chest, some long frozen part of herself beginning to thaw. You've been watching me, she said. These past weeks. Every night, Frederick admitted. Watching the house party, watching Beatrice and Alistair, and watching you endure their cruelty with dignity, watching you slip away to the library to read, watching you walk in this garden alone because you cannot bear another moment of their company. I should feel guilty for the surveillance, but instead I feel protective, which is absurd given I have no right to protect you, and nothing to offer you but danger and scandal. Then we're well matched, Arabella said, surprised by her own boldness. Because I have nothing to lose. My reputation is already damaged by age and poverty and unmarriageability. At least if I'm ruined helping you, it will be for something meaningful, rather than for the crime of existing inconveniently. They stood facing each other in the moonlit garden, and Arabella was intensely aware of her state of undress, of how intimate this felt, with her hair loose and only her nightgown beneath the cloak, of how Frederick's eyes kept dropping to her mouth before jerking away as though he were fighting some internal battle. What do you need me to do? She asked, and her voice came out breathier than intended. Search Beatrice's rooms when you can do so safely, Frederick said. Look for letters, documents, anything that might prove conspiracy. Watch her interactions with Alistair. They're planning something. I've seen them meet secretly in the conservatory late at night, heard fragments of conversation about keeping secrets and being untouchable once they're married. If we can prove they worked together to frame me, if we can demonstrate motive and opportunity combined with proof that Henrietta is alive, we might be able to restore my name. Might, Arabella noted. There are no guarantees. None. Frederick agreed. I could be hanged if I'm caught. You could be ruined. We could discover nothing, and I could remain an outlaw forever while Beatrice becomes a duchess and lives in comfort built on lies and murder charges. But even a chance is more than I've had in 3 years, and you, Miss Dashwood, you give me hope for the first time since this nightmare began. Call me Arabella, she said impulsively. If we're to be conspirators, we should dispense with formality. Arabella, Frederick repeated, and her name on his lips sent heat racing through her despite the October cold. "Then you must call me Frederick, at least when we're alone. Though we should not be alone." "This is wildly inappropriate. I am wildly inappropriate," Arabella said, and found herself smiling. "That seems to be my defining characteristic these days." "Good," Frederick said, and he smiled back, the expression transforming his austere features into something warmer, more approachable. "Inappropriate women are far more interesting than appropriate ones, and infinitely more useful for espionage." They arranged to meet every third night in the garden after the house had settled, to share information and plan strategy. And as Frederick prepared to disappear back into the shadows, he caught her hand and pressed it to his lips in a gesture so old-fashioned and courtly that Arabella felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for believing me, for helping me, for being brave enough to risk everything on the word of a wanted man." "Thank you for remembering me," Arabella replied, "for thinking I was worth remembering." Then he was gone, melting into the darkness beyond the fountain, and she stood alone in the garden with the taste of possibility on her tongue, and the feeling that she had somehow stepped out of one life and into another, that the invisible spinster who had arrived at Dashwood Manor 3 days prior no longer existed, and in her place stood someone new, someone who asked questions and took risks, and refused to accept that the official version of events was the only truth worth pursuing. And though she knew this transformation would bring consequences she could barely imagine, she also knew with bone-deep certainty that she would not trade this feeling, this aliveness, this sense of purpose and partnership, and being genuinely seen for the first time in years, not for all the safe companion positions and respectable obscurity in England. The week that followed transformed Arabella in ways she could not have predicted, each clandestine meeting with Frederick in the moonlit garden adding layers to her understanding of both the conspiracy and the man himself, while her days were spent in careful observation and dangerous searches that required every ounce of courage she possessed. Frederick had taken a position as a new groom in the stables, his aristocratic features hidden beneath a cap pulled low and dirt artfully applied, his posture deliberately hunched to disguise his height, and Arabella had to stop herself from staring when she saw him holding horses for the guests, his hands gentle on the reins and his eyes meeting hers for just a moment with an intimacy that made her breath catch. She searched Beatrice's rooms during a musicale, slipping away while everyone was occupied with a particularly tedious soprano, her heart hammering as she rifled through drawers and pressed panels looking for the hiding place she knew must exist because women like Beatrice always kept insurance. The letters were hidden in a false bottom of a hat box, tied with ribbon as though they were love notes rather than evidence of conspiracy, and Arabella's hands shook as she read correspondence dated 3 years prior between Beatrice and Alastair, detailing their plan with chilling precision. Alastair had been the presumed heir before Frederick married and produced children. Beatrice had been overlooked in favor of her more beautiful sister, and together they had constructed a scheme to eliminate both obstacles at once by convincing Henrietta to run away and then framing Frederick for her murder. The letters discussed payment to a servant who would plant the bloody dress, mentioned Beatrice's tears as she identified the garment as belonging to her sister, detailed how they would wait a respectable period before announcing their own engagement once Frederick was declared dead and Alastair inherited. Arabella copied what she could in shaking handwriting, replaced the originals exactly as she had found them, and barely made it back to the musicale before the soprano finished her assault on Mozart. That night in the garden she handed Frederick her notes and watched his face harden as he read by moonlight, watched years of pain and anger and helpless frustration play across his features, before he looked up at her with something like reverence. "This is it," he said quietly. "This proves conspiracy, proves motive, proves they worked together. But we still need Henrietta alive and willing to testify. or a court could argue the letters only prove Alistair and Beatrice knew she ran away, not that I didn't kill her afterward. "Where is she?" Arabella asked. "Can you reach her?" Frederick's expression turned bleak. "Italy, as I said. Naples, living under the name Mrs. James Cooper with her naval officer husband. I have her direction, have been writing to her for 3 years, begging her to come forward, but she's terrified of her family's reaction, terrified of the scandal, and she's with child now and unwilling to risk the journey. I would go myself, bring her back, but I have no funds for passage. Everything I own was seized when I was declared dead. I've been surviving by robbing travelers on remote roads, taking just enough to eat and stable my horse, but I'm no highwayman by training, and the work is dangerous and degrading, and I hate what I've become." "You're surviving," Arabella said fiercely. "You're fighting to clear your name against impossible odds. There's no shame in that." "There's shame in involving you," Frederick replied, and his hand came up to touch her cheek with a gentleness that made her want to weep. "You risk everything every time you search a room, every time you meet me here. If Edmund discovers what you're doing, if Beatrice suspects, they'll destroy you." "I'm already destroyed by their standards," Arabella reminded him. "Too old, too poor, too inconvenient. Let me be useful instead of ornamental. Let me matter." "You matter to me," Frederick said, and then he was kissing her, soft and desperate and tasting of loneliness and longing, and Arabella kissed him back with 3 years of resignation burning away in the heat of finally being wanted by someone who saw her truly. They broke apart, gasping, and Frederick looked stricken. "I should not have done that," he said. "I have no right, no prospects, nothing to offer you." "I don't care," Arabella said simply, and found that it was true, that somewhere in the past week she had stopped caring about propriety and reputation and all the rules that had governed her life, and discovered instead that being alive, being engaged in something meaningful, being wanted by a good man facing impossible odds, mattered infinitely more than the tepid approval of people like Beatrice Tilney. The hunting party was Edmund's attempt to impress the Duke with his country hospitality. 40 guests in traditional scarlet, mounted on horses borrowed from neighboring estates, since Edmund could not afford enough quality animals himself, and Arabella had been assigned a mare known for docility because Edmund could not risk her embarrassing him by falling. She was a competent rider despite limited practice, but the mare was sluggish and unresponsive, fighting the bit in a way that suggested temper rather than training, and Arabella was struggling to keep pace with the party when the animal suddenly bolted, charging through the woods at a pace that felt suicidal given the low-hanging branches and hidden roots. She heard shouting behind her, felt the saddle slip as the girth loosened, and realized with cold terror that this was no accident, that someone had sabotaged her tack, and then a branch caught her shoulder and she was falling, the ground rushing up to meet her. Strong arms caught her before impact, a body interposing itself between her and the earth, and she found herself cradled against Frederick's chest as he rolled to absorb the momentum, his breathing harsh in her ear, and his arms locked around her with desperate strength. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, pulling back to look at her, hands running over her arms and legs, checking for injury. "Arabella, look at me. Are you hurt?" "You called me Arabella," she said breathlessly, shocked by the fall and by his sudden appearance and by the way his face showed naked terror on her behalf. "I've been calling you Arabella in my mind for weeks," Frederick said, and his voice cracked. "Forgive me, I should not presume, but when I saw your horse bolt and the saddle slip, I stopped thinking entirely." "Don't apologize," Arabella managed. "I rather prefer it to Miss Dashwood." Then the rest of the hunting party was thundering into the clearing, horses pulled up short and riders dismounting in chaos, and she heard the gasps of recognition as they saw Frederick's face, the cap lost in the rescue, and his features exposed to the afternoon light. "Good God, that's Frederick Wentworth!" someone shouted, and then Beatrice was pushing through the crowd, her face twisted with vindictive triumph. "Seize him!" she cried. "He's a murderer. He's kidnapped Miss Dashwood. Don't be absurd," Arabella said, and she struggled to her feet despite Frederick's attempt to keep her seated, despite the pain in her shoulder and the way the world tilted alarmingly. "His Grace saved my life. The only criminals here are you and your co-conspirator." She pulled the copied letters from inside her riding jacket, where she had taken to keeping them after finding them, pages now crumpled from the fall but still legible, and she held them up for all to see. "Shall I read these aloud, Miss Tilney, or will you confess?" The clearing went silent, except for the sound of horses stamping, and somewhere distant, the baying of hounds, and Beatrice's beautiful face contorted into something ugly and desperate. "You pathetic, desperate spinster!" she spat. "You'd destroy me for a man who'll never marry you because he has nothing." "He has his honor," Arabella said calmly, meeting those furious eyes without flinching. "That's infinitely more than you possess. These letters prove you and Alistair conspired 3 years ago to eliminate Frederick's engagement to your sister, that you convinced Henrietta to run away, and then framed Frederick for her murder, so Alistair could inherit the title and marry you instead. It was all planned, all calculated, and you've been living on lies ever since." "That's not—" Alistair started, but his voice broke, and Arabella saw him looking between Beatrice and the assembled guests with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse. "It's not what it sounds like. It was Beatrice's plan," he said, and the words came faster now, panicked and pleading. "All of it. I only wanted the title. Wanted what should have been mine if Frederick hadn't been born first. But she wanted revenge on Henrietta for being chosen, for being prettier and sweeter and everything Beatrice could never be. She planned everything. The servant who planted the dress, the timing, the evidence. I just went along with it because she promised we'd be together, promised we'd share everything." "You coward!" Beatrice shrieked, launching herself at Alistair with clawed hands. "You weak, pathetic coward! I gave you everything and you're going to blame me." Henrietta deserved to lose everything for her disobedience, for choosing some nobody naval officer over a duke. I deserved that title, deserved that life, and I took it the only way I could. Guards had arrived, summoned by Edmund, who stood pale and shaking at the edge of the clearing, and they seized Beatrice as she fought and screamed, her cultured veneer completely shattered to reveal the desperate, envious creature beneath. Alistair collapsed to his knees, begging for mercy, claiming he had been manipulated, and Frederick stood silent and dignified amid the chaos, his hand finding Arabella's and holding tight. "You've sacrificed your reputation for me," he said quietly, "for her ears alone. Everyone here knows now that you've been helping me, meeting me, working with a wanted criminal. My reputation was worthless to begin with," Arabella replied, squeezing his fingers. "But this, helping you, fighting beside you, this has worth." The aftermath was chaos and confusion, magistrates summoned from the nearest town, statements taken from everyone present. Beatrice and Alistair both arrested on charges of conspiracy and fraud, while Frederick was held under what amounted to house arrest in one of Edmund's guest rooms pending investigation. The letters were examined by legal authorities, Arabella's testimony recorded in excruciating detail, and slowly, painfully, the truth emerged like something long buried finally seeing daylight. Frederick had been framed, Henrietta was alive. Beatrice and Alistair had conspired to destroy him for their own advancement, and the scandal that erupted made the original accusations 3 years prior seem tame by comparison. But Frederick's title could not simply be restored on the strength of letters and testimony alone, the solicitors explained with maddening bureaucratic precision. Parliament would need to vote, Henrietta would need to be located and brought back from Italy to testify in person, the original trial in absentia would need to be formally overturned, and the process could take months, if not longer. Frederick was exonerated in the court of public opinion, but remained legally dead, his estates still frozen, his fortune still inaccessible, and Arabella watched him struggle with the knowledge that vindication was not the same as restoration. Edmund was horrified and embarrassed in equal measure, furious that his house party had become the scene of such scandal, but unable to deny that Arabella had been instrumental in exposing the truth. And his wife suggested coolly that perhaps Arabella's unconventional methods were less damaging than having continued to host criminals unknowingly. The guests departed in a flurry of scandalized excitement, already composing the letters they would write to friends describing the dramatic events. And Dashwood Manor settled into uneasy quiet, with Frederick confined to his room and Arabella confined to hers by Edmund's decree that they not be seen together until the legal situation resolved. But late that night, Arabella crept through the halls to Frederick's door, knocked softly, and slipped inside when he opened it, looking exhausted and defeated. "Thank you," he said simply, and pulled her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of the terror he had felt watching her fall, the relief of having her safe, the agony of not knowing what came next. They stood wrapped together in the darkness, and Arabella felt his heart beating against hers, and knew that whatever happened, whatever legal processes ground forward or failed to resolve, she had found something in this week of danger and investigation and midnight meetings that she would not trade for all the proper, safe, respectable futures in England, had found herself, and found love, and found purpose. And even if Frederick could never marry her, even if his title was never restored and his fortune remained frozen and they were forced to live separately in scandal and poverty, she would still choose this moment, this feeling, this knowledge that she mattered to someone who saw her truly over the slow death of companion positions and society's tepid tolerance. The days following Beatrice's arrest stretched into weeks of agonizing waiting, while solicitors debated precedents and magistrates requested additional documentation, and Parliament moved with the glacial deliberation of men whose comfort did not depend on swift resolution. And Frederick remained confined to Dashwood Manor under loose supervision that felt more like purgatory than liberation, technically exonerated in truth, but legally still dead. His title in abeyance, and his fortune frozen, and his future suspended in amber, while bureaucrats shuffled papers and demanded testimony from a woman who lived half a continent away. November arrived with cold rain that turned the estate gardens to mud and stripped the last leaves from the trees, and Arabella found herself watching from her window as Frederick paced the terrace below like a caged animal, his frustration visible in every movement, and she ached to go to him, but Edmund had decreed they maintain propriety until the legal situation resolved, as though propriety mattered after she had publicly declared her belief in his innocence before 40 witnesses and become the subject of scandal sheets across England. She saw Frederick at meals, stilted formal affairs where they sat at opposite ends of the table, and made careful conversation about weather and trivial matters, while Edmund watched them both with the wary expression of a man expecting explosion, and she noticed how Frederick's eyes found hers across the distance, how his hands clenched when she spoke, how he seemed to be fighting some internal battle that left him looking more exhausted each day. The house party guests had departed in a frenzy of gossip and barely concealed excitement at having witnessed such drama, and Dashwood Manor felt enormous and empty in their absence, echoing with the sound of rain and the crackle of inadequate fires and the weight of words left unspoken. Arabella spent her days reading in the library, the same books Frederick had once owned, his marginalia, like conversations with a ghost, and she spent her nights lying awake in her cold room imagining the future they might have if Parliament voted favourably, if Henrietta agreed to return from Italy, if the restoration of Frederick's title somehow materialized from the morass of legal complications. She expected him to come to her, expected a proposal, or at least a declaration of intent, some acknowledgement of what had grown between them during those midnight meetings in the garden and the investigation that had consumed the past weeks. But instead, Frederick seemed to withdraw further each day, his conversation growing more formal and his eyes growing more haunted until Arabella wanted to shake him and demand he explain what had changed. The answer came late one evening when she found him in the library staring into the fire, and she closed the door behind her with deliberate firmness and said his name into the silence. He turned to look at her, and his expression was so bleak she felt her heart contract with premonition. "I won't do this to you, Arabella," he said without preamble. "I won't make you wait indefinitely for a future that may never come." "You're not making me do anything," she replied, crossing to stand before him. "I choose this. I choose you. You choose me now, in the romance of it all," Frederick said, and his voice was rough with emotion he was clearly struggling to control. "But in a year, 5 years, when you're still unmarried, still scandalous, still waiting for a man who may never be restored, you'll hate me." Arabella stared at him in disbelief. "How dare you tell me what I'll feel?" she said, and anger surged hot and welcome through her veins. "I've spent my entire life being told what I should want, who I should be. For once, I know my own mind, and you presume to correct me as though I'm some silly girl who doesn't understand her own heart. And I know mine." Frederick interrupted, and he reached for her hands, gripping them with desperate strength. "I love you too much to ruin you further. If I regain everything, title and fortune, and I'll return and court you properly. But I won't bind you to promises I may not be able to keep. I won't watch you waste your youth waiting for a restoration that might never happen. You deserve better than a tarnished duke and a lifetime of whispers." "So you're leaving?" Arabella said, and she felt something crack inside her chest, some fragile hope she had been nurturing despite every rational argument against it. "Like everyone else, you've decided I'm not worth the difficulty." "You're worth everything," Frederick said fiercely. "That's why I'm letting you go. That's why I have to let you go, before I trap you in my disaster of a life and steal whatever chances you might have for happiness." Then he kissed her, desperate and farewell, and Arabella kissed him back with fury and heartbreak tangled together, tasting salt from tears she could not tell were his or hers. And when they broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers for one suspended moment before stepping away and leaving her alone in the library with the fire dying and the rain hammering against the windows. The next morning Frederick was gone, his room empty, and a note left on the breakfast table addressed to Edmund, explaining that he had departed for Italy to retrieve Henrietta personally, that the legal process was taking too long and he needed to act, rather than wait for bureaucrats to decide his fate, that he would return with proof of Henrietta's survival and clear his name properly rather than lingering in limbo. There was a second note tucked inside, addressed to Arabella in that familiar slanting hand, and she carried it to her room before opening it with shaking fingers. "Arabella," it read, "forgive me. I am going to make myself worthy of you, or die trying. Don't wait for me. Live. Be happy. If I return and find you married to a good man who cherishes you, I'll bear it, knowing I gave you that chance. Yours, though I have no right to be, F." She read it 3 times before the words stopped swimming before her eyes, read it until she had memorized every stroke of ink, and then she folded it carefully and placed it in her drawer and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to sob into her pillow before emerging with dry eyes and the familiar mask of resignation settling back over her features like old armor retrieved from storage. The following weeks passed in a grey haze of rain and routine, and Arabella found herself reverting to old patterns, becoming invisible again, drifting through meals and conversations without truly engaging, and she hated how easily she slipped back into that role. Hated Frederick for leaving her, hated herself for caring, hated the entire situation with an intensity that felt like the only real emotion she could access through the numbness. Edmund was surprisingly sympathetic, finding her one afternoon in the library and sitting across from her with unusual gentleness. "I know something of what you're feeling," he said quietly. When I married Catherine, it was for money. Father had gambled away everything, you see. The estate, mother's dowry, everything. I married to save us from complete ruin, and Catherine knew it, knew I didn't love her, and I've spent 10 years in a comfortable, respectable, utterly loveless marriage. I don't wish that for you, but I also don't wish for you to waste your life waiting for a man who may never return. Arabella looked at him with new understanding, seeing for the first time the loneliness beneath his social climbing, the resignation that mirrored her own. "What would you have me do?" she asked. "Lord Morland has made an offer for you," Edmund said. "He's 65, widowed, kind by all accounts. He wants a companion, someone educated to read to him and manage his household. He's offering a generous settlement, promises you'll be treated with respect, expects nothing beyond companionship. It's security, Arabella. Safety. A position in society that won't leave you dependent on my charity or forced into a governess role." "At my age," Arabella said flatly. "With my reputation?" "Say it, Edmund." Edmund sighed. "I only want you safe and settled. Wentworth may never return. Even if he does, there's no guarantee Parliament will restore his title. The process could take years. You could be 40 before anything resolves, and by then what choices will you have?" "I know," Arabella said, and she did know, knew all of it with brutal clarity. "I know all of it, and yet you'll wait for him anyway, won't you?" Edmund said. "Even if it destroys your last chance at marriage?" Arabella didn't answer because she didn't know the answer, didn't know if the woman who had investigated conspiracies and confronted criminals and fallen in love with an outlaw duke could reconcile herself to Lord Morland's kind, passionless offer. But she also didn't know if she could bear to wait years for a man who had chosen to leave her, who had decided without consultation what was best for her future, who had taken away her agency in the name of protecting her. Lord Morland called the following week, arriving in a well-appointed carriage with flowers that were expensive and tasteful, and Arabella received him in the drawing-room while Edmund made himself scarce with obvious intention. Morland was exactly as described, elderly but upright, kind-faced, speaking to her with genuine respect rather than the condescension she had expected. "I understand this is not a romantic proposal, Miss Dashwood," he said gently. "I am too old for such pretensions, and you are too intelligent to believe them. I offer companionship, security, and respect. My estate is comfortable, my health is reasonable for my age, and I would be honored to have someone of your education and character as my wife. I expect nothing beyond your company at meals and perhaps assistance with correspondence. You would have your own rooms, your own pursuits, your own life within the structure of marriage. It is not passion, but it is peace." Peace sounded almost appealing after weeks of heartbreak and uncertainty, and Arabella found herself considering the offer with a seriousness that would have horrified the woman who had stood in midnight gardens making plans with a wanted man. What Lord Morland offered was everything she had been told to want since her first failed season, everything sensible and practical and safe. And she was so tired of being brave, so tired of hoping, so tired of the constant ache of Frederick's absence, that some mornings she woke and forgot why she felt hollow, until memory crashed back and stole her breath. She told Morland she would consider his offer, and he departed with courtesy and without pressure. And Arabella sat alone in the drawing-room watching rain sheet down the windows, and wondered if this was how love died. Not in dramatic gestures, but in slow erosion, in practical considerations, wearing away at romantic ideals until nothing remained but the sensible choice. What she didn't know was that Frederick had been writing to her, letters sent from Dover before he sailed, and from Paris during his journey south, letters detailing his progress, and his love, and his desperate hope that she would wait despite his instruction otherwise. Letters that arrived at Dashwood Manor and were intercepted by Edmund, who read them with growing concern and made the decision to hide them, believing he was protecting his sister from false hope, from the agony of waiting for a restoration that might never come, believing in his pragmatic heart that Lord Morland's offer was better for her future than promises from a legally dead duke travelling through Europe on borrowed money with no guarantee of success. The letters accumulated in Edmund's desk drawer, water-stained from their journey, filled with Frederick's careful script detailing his search for Henrietta and his certainty that he would return to claim Arabella properly, and she never knew they existed, never knew he had not simply abandoned her, but was rather working desperately to become worthy of her, and her ignorance fed her despair, and made Lord Morland's practical proposal seem increasingly like the only sensible path forward. November darkened into early December, and still no word came, no news of Frederick's progress or Henrietta's cooperation, and Arabella felt herself sliding back into the resigned acceptance that had characterized her life before the midnight robbery, felt the brief, bright flame of agency and purpose guttering out, and she hated it, but didn't know how to stop it, didn't know how to maintain transformation in the absence of the person who had catalyzed it. She stood at her window one frozen evening, watching ice form on the bare branches, and thought about Lord Morland's kind eyes and comfortable estate, and the peace he promised, thought about Frederick somewhere in Italy, searching for a woman who might refuse to return, about the months or years that might pass before anything resolved, about her own advancing age and diminishing options, and she felt the weight of reality pressing down on the fragile hope she had built during those weeks of investigation and midnight meetings, felt it cracking under the strain of Frederick's absence and her own exhaustion, and she wondered if choosing security over love made her a coward or simply a realist, if accepting Lord Morland would be betrayal or survival. And she didn't know anything except that the woman who had boldly confronted Beatrice Tilney and publicly defended a wanted man felt very far away now, like someone Arabella had been briefly before common sense and circumstance reasserted their authority and reminded her that transformation required more than a few weeks of courage, required sustained belief in possibilities she was finding increasingly difficult to maintain in Frederick's devastating silence. February arrived with the grudging promise of spring somewhere beyond the grey skies and persistent cold, and Arabella existed in a state of suspended animation, neither accepting Lord Morland's patient proposal nor refusing it, simply drifting through days that felt identical and equally meaningless. The vibrant woman who had investigated conspiracies and confronted criminals receding into memory like a dream half forgotten upon waking. She took walks in the frozen gardens, read books without absorbing their contents, made polite conversation at meals, and felt nothing except a vague background ache that had become so familiar she barely noticed it anymore, the way one stops noticing a chronic pain that simply becomes part of existence. Lord Morland called periodically with flowers and gentle conversation, never pressing for an answer, but making his continued availability clear, and Arabella knew she should either accept him and secure her future, or refuse him and face whatever consequences came from remaining unmarried and dependent on Edmund's increasingly strained charity, but she could not seem to summon the energy to make either choice, could not seem to care enough about her own future to take action in any direction. Edmund watched her with concern that was almost tender, this brother who had dismissed her so casually before, and sometimes she caught him looking at her with something like guilt, but he said nothing, and she asked nothing, and they continued their careful dance around the truth that she was slowly dying inside from the combination of Frederick's abandonment and her own inability to reclaim the courage she had briefly possessed. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-February, a rider arrived from London with news that spread through the household like wildfire, servants whispering, and Edmund emerging from his study looking stunned, and when he found Arabella in the library, his expression was complicated beyond description. "Frederick Wentworth has returned from Italy," he said without preamble, "with Henrietta Tilney alive and willing to testify, Parliament voted yesterday to restore his title and estates. He's the Duke of Wentworth again, fully reinstated, fortune unfrozen, name cleared of all charges. The book Arabella had been pretending to read slipped from her fingers, and she felt her heart, that organ she had thought numbed beyond response, suddenly hammering against her ribs with painful intensity. "He's back," she managed. "He succeeded." "He did," Edmund confirmed. "Society is in an uproar. Every eligible young woman in London is already positioning herself to catch his attention. The betting books at the clubs are full of speculation about which heiress he'll court to repair his finances after 3 years of exile. He'll need to marry well, marry strategically, choose someone who brings political connections and substantial dowry to compensate for the years of lost income." Arabella felt something inside her crack, and she recognized it as the last fragile hope she had been protecting, despite every rational argument against it. The foolish belief that if Frederick returned successful, he would return for her. And now Edmund was calmly explaining all the reasons why a newly restored duke would never choose an aging spinster with no fortune and a scandal-tainted reputation. "Of course," she said, and her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "That makes perfect sense. I should write to Lord Morland and accept his proposal. I've kept him waiting long enough." Edmund opened his mouth as though to say something, closed it again, and then nodded slowly. "That would be wise." He agreed. "I'll have the letter sent this afternoon." But before Arabella could retrieve paper and compose the words that would seal her fate in Lord Morland's comfortable cage, there came the sound of carriage wheels on gravel, the kind of grand arrival that suggested importance and ceremony, and Edmund moved to the window with a frown. "Who on earth?" he muttered, and then his expression transformed into something Arabella could not read. "It's Wentworth," he said. "Frederick is here." The next minutes passed in a blur of confusion and protocol, servants rushing to receive the Duke properly, Edmund hurrying to change into more formal attire, and Arabella standing frozen in the library, while her mind refused to process what was happening, why Frederick would come here, what he could possibly want. She heard his voice in the entrance hall, that educated accent now backed by ducal authority, heard Edmund's flustered greeting, and then Edmund was at the library door gesturing for her to join them in the great hall. "He's asking to see you," Edmund said, and his expression was strange. "Both of us, actually. Formally." Arabella followed on legs that felt unreliable, smoothing her dress with hands that shook, and emerged into the great hall to find Frederick, Wentworth standing in full ducal regalia, perfectly tailored coat and immaculate cravat, and the signet ring she had returned to him, now properly on his finger, and he looked every inch the powerful aristocrat he had been born to be, except for his eyes, which found hers across the space and held an expression of such desperate hope that her breath caught. "Your Grace," Edmund said with the excessive formality of a man uncertain of his position. "Welcome to Dashwood Manor. We heard of your restoration. Congratulations are in order." "Thank you," Frederick replied, but his gaze never left Arabella's face. "I am here to ask permission to court your sister, with the intention of asking for her hand in marriage, should she find me acceptable." The silence that followed was absolute, except for the ticking of the hall clock, and Arabella felt the world tilt as though reality had suddenly rearranged itself into a configuration she could not comprehend. Edmund recovered first. "You're a duke again, Wentworth," he said slowly. "You could have anyone. Every family in England would welcome your suit. Why Arabella?" "Because anyone is not Arabella," Frederick said simply. "And I learned in Italy that titles and fortunes are cold comfort without the woman you love. I spent 3 months tracking down Henrietta, convincing her to return, navigating bureaucracy and parliamentary procedure, and every moment of it I was sustained by the thought of coming back to her, of earning the right to court her properly, of proving myself worthy of the extraordinary woman who risked everything to help me when I had nothing to offer but danger and scandal. Edmund's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something like comprehension, and he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a thick stack of letters tied with string. "These arrived over the past 3 months," he said quietly. "From Italy, from Paris, from Dover. I kept them from her. I thought I was protecting her from false hope, from the agony of waiting for something that might never happen. I was wrong." Frederick went very pale. "You kept my letters," he said, and his voice was dangerously soft. "Every week I wrote, pouring my heart onto paper, begging her to wait, telling her I was coming back, and you kept them from her. I thought it was for the best," Edmund said defensively. "Lord Morland had made an excellent offer, and I believed practical security was better than romantic uncertainty. I see now that I was thinking of my own convenience rather than her happiness." Arabella crossed the hall and took the letters from Edmund's hand with fingers that trembled, and she untied the string and began to read, and with each page she felt the numbness that had characterized the past months cracking apart to reveal the raw pain beneath, the fury at having been denied this, at having spent weeks believing Frederick had abandoned her when he had been writing to her faithfully, desperately, lovingly. "You wrote me every week, wrote me," she said to Frederick, and her voice shook with emotion she could no longer contain. "Every week for 3 months, Frederick confirmed, moving toward her. "I poured my heart onto those pages. I told you about finding Henrietta in Naples, about convincing her to return, about the parliamentary process, about how every step forward was taken with the knowledge that I was coming back to you, that nothing mattered without you." "And Edmund hid them," Arabella said, fury and relief tangled together. "I thought you'd forgotten me. I almost accepted another proposal." Frederick stopped as though struck, his face draining of color. "Did you?" he asked, and the question was barely audible. "No," Arabella said, and she saw him sway with relief. "Because even believing you'd abandoned me, I couldn't settle for less than what we had. Even briefly. Even when I thought it was over, I couldn't accept comfort in place of love." "Then I've been a fool twice over," Frederick said, and he closed the remaining distance between them. Once for leaving, for making the decision without truly consulting you, for assuming I knew what was best for your future, and again for not ensuring my letters reached you, for not confirming you'd received them, for leaving you in silence when you deserved daily reassurance. "You were a fool for deciding my future without consulting me," Arabella said, and she held the letters against her chest like armor. "If you want to court me, Frederick, you'll do so as an equal, asks an equal, not as a duke condescending to save a spinster, not as a man who thinks he knows better than I do what I need or want or can endure. I've spent my entire life being told what to do, who to be, what to settle for. If we are to have a future, it will be built on partnership, on mutual respect, on the understanding that I am not some fragile creature who needs protection, but rather a woman who has proven herself capable of courage and action and choice." Frederick stared at her, and then slowly, wonderfully, he smiled. "You've changed," he said. "You helped me change," Arabella replied. "Then you left before seeing what you'd created. Now you must court this version of me, the woman who knows her worth and refuses to compromise it, the woman who investigated conspiracies and confronted criminals and publicly defended you when the entire world believed you guilty. If you want that woman, you'll have to earn her. It will be my greatest honor," Frederick said, and he took her hand and brought it to his lips with the same courtly gesture he had used in the garden months before. "I will court you properly, publicly, with all the attention and devotion you deserve. I will prove to you and to all of society that you are the only woman I could ever want, the only partner worthy of standing beside me." The courtship that followed was unlike anything London society had seen in years. A duke newly restored to power and fortune choosing to publicly pursue a woman who, by all conventional measures, should have been beneath his notice, and the scandal sheets had a field day with speculation and commentary, and barely concealed astonishment. Frederick called at Dashwood Manor daily with flowers and books and thoughtful conversation, took Arabella on public promenades through Hyde Park where everyone could see them together, attended literary salons and exhibitions because she enjoyed them rather than because they advanced his political interests, and made absolutely clear through word and deed that his choice was deliberate and permanent, and utterly indifferent to social expectation. Arabella bloomed under the attention like a plant long denied sunlight, and she watched with satisfaction as the same women who had dismissed her as invisible now scrambled to befriend her, as matrons who had written her off as unmarriageable now claimed they had always seen her potential, as society rewrote history to make their match seem inevitable rather than improbable. Lord Morland withdrew his proposal with grace and genuine good wishes, and Arabella learned months later that he had found happiness with an age-appropriate widow who shared his love of gardening and classical music, and she was glad for him, glad that his kindness had found proper reward. After a month of courtship that felt both agonizingly slow and thrillingly perfect, Frederick held a ball at Wentworth House, the massive estate that had been closed during his exile, now restored to glory with chandeliers blazing and musicians playing, and 500 guests assembled to celebrate his return to society, and Arabella stood in the ballroom wearing a gown of deep sapphire that matched the stone in the signet ring, and felt more beautiful than she had in her entire life, not because of the dress, but because of how Frederick looked at her, as though she were the only person in the crowded room, as though everything he had fought for had been for this moment. The ball was in full swing when Frederick called for silence, standing in the center of the ballroom with Arabella beside him, and the assembled guests quieted with the avid attention of people sensing drama about to unfold. "I once gave you this ring in darkness, anonymously, without the courage to claim you openly," Frederick said, and his voice carried clearly through the vast space as he withdrew the signet ring from his finger and held it up for all to see. "I offer it again now, in the light, before all of London." Then he knelt before her, there in front of 500 witnesses, and Arabella felt tears prick her eyes at the gesture, at the public vulnerability, at the complete reversal of that midnight robbery, where he had been masked and desperate, and she had been merely another victim. "Arabella Dashwood," Frederick said, and his voice was steady, despite the emotion visible in his face. "You are the bravest, most intelligent, most extraordinary woman I have ever known. You saw worth in me when I was a wanted criminal. You fought for me when I was helpless. You waited for me when I gave you every reason not to. Will you do me the impossible honor of becoming my wife?" The ballroom held its collective breath, and Arabella looked down at Frederick kneeling before her, at the ring he offered, at the public declaration he was making, and she thought about the invisible spinster she had been a year ago, and the woman she had become through courage and choice, and the transformative power of being truly seen by someone who valued her, not despite her unconventionality, but because of it. "I waited not because you asked me to," she said clearly, pitching her voice to carry to every corner of the room, "but because I chose to. I accept not because you're a duke, but because you're Frederick, because you remembered a kindness from years ago, because you trusted me with your secrets, because you see me as a partner rather than an ornament. Yes, I will marry you." The ballroom erupted in applause, and Frederick stood and slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit perfectly, and then he kissed her there before 500 witnesses with a passion that made several matrons fan themselves and set the gossip mills spinning for months afterward. "Well," Arabella heard one society matron whisper to another as Frederick led her onto the floor for the first dance. "I suppose it's rather romantic after all. Their wedding took place in April, exactly 1 year after the midnight robbery that had changed both their lives, and Arabella walked down the aisle of the Wentworth family chapel on Edmund's arm, wearing orange blossoms in her hair and carrying the journals Frederick had written years before, journals she had read by candlelight in Dashwood Manor's library, and which had helped her fall in love with his mind before she fully knew his heart. She was 29 years old, considered ancient by society's standards, and Frederick was 34, and neither of them cared in the slightest what anyone thought, because they had fought too hard for this happiness to let convention diminish it. The wedding breakfast was magnificent, and the speeches were touching, and when they finally departed for Wentworth House as husband and wife, the guests threw rice and flowers and shouted blessings, and Arabella looked back once to see Edmund standing with his loveless wife and thought she saw genuine happiness in his expression, genuine joy that his sister had found what he had sacrificed. They spent their wedding night at Wentworth House and the weeks that followed in exploring their new life together, and Arabella discovered that being a duchess was far less interesting than being Frederick's wife, that the title and fortune and social position mattered infinitely less than the partnership they had forged through danger and separation and the hard work of truly knowing another person. She took over management of the estate libraries, began correspondence with Henrietta, who had settled in Naples and was raising her, growing family in peaceful obscurity, wrote a series of articles about legal reform that were published anonymously but created substantial discussion in parliamentary circles, and slowly, carefully, built a life that was entirely her own rather than one dictated by others' expectations. On an evening in late October, nearly a year and a half after that first midnight robbery, Arabella found herself in a carriage travelling the same road through Windsor Forest, and she smiled as Frederick pulled her close and gestured out the window at the familiar landscape. "Do you remember this road?" he asked. "This very spot." "How could I forget?" Arabella replied, laughing. "A masked criminal robbed me here." "Gave you a ring, I recall," Frederick corrected. "Hardly a robbery. He stole something far more valuable than jewels," Arabella said, and she placed his hand on her abdomen where their child grew, visible now in the curve of her belly. "Oh," Frederick said, suddenly understanding. "What was that?" "My resignation," Arabella replied, touching his face with fingers that wore both the signet ring and her wedding band. "My certainty that I'd never be chosen. He stole my despair and left possibility in its place." "Best trade I ever made," Frederick said, and he kissed her there in the carriage as it rolled through the forest, where autumn leaves fell like benediction, and the moon rose full and bright overhead. And Arabella thought about the invisible woman she had been and the beloved duchess she had become, and knew that the transformation was not because Frederick had rescued her, but because he had seen her truly and given her the courage to rescue herself, to choose action over resignation, to believe that worth was determined not by youth or beauty or conventional advantage, but by character and courage and the willingness to risk everything for connection and truth and love. And she was grateful beyond measure for that midnight robbery that had begun as terror and ended as transformation, that had taken a woman. Society had discarded and revealed her to be exactly what she had always been, beneath the layers of dismissal and judgment. Someone extraordinary waiting for the chance to prove it.